I never thought the land my father bled for, the soil my mother prayed over, and the fields I grew up working on could ever be taken from me with a single piece of paper. But that's exactly what happened. In the space of one afternoon, I lost 3,200 acres of my family's farmland, the very land that held our history, our sweat, and our future. Imagine watching your entire life shrink into someone else's hands. Stolen not with guns or violence, but with signatures and lies. That's what the HOA did to me. They weren't neighbors anymore. They were predators dressed in polite clothes. And at that moment, standing on the porch where my father once taught me how to be a man, I swore to myself I'd take everything from them, piece by piece, until they knew what real loss felt like. It had been an ordinary Thursday morning when I noticed the strange trucks on my dirt road. Men in suits were walking through my cornfields, pointing, nodding, laughing as though they owned the place. I stormed down from the porch and demanded to know what was going on, but they looked at me like I was the trespasser. One of them, a smug man with slicked-back hair, pulled out a folded set of papers and waved them in my face. "This land belongs to the HOA now," he said as if he was announcing the weather. My hands shook as I snatched the papers. Fraud, every line screamed it, but the signatures at the bottom looked official, sealed with a stamp from the county office. I felt my knees weaken. My father's farm, the only thing he left me before he died, was gone. I rushed to the county office, my chest tight with panic, only to find out the nightmare was real. Somehow, the HOA had manipulated the system, filed false claims, and used shady connections to transfer the deed. They had labeled my land as abandoned community property, ignoring the fact that I'd lived and worked there all my life. When I confronted the clerk, all she could do was shrug and say, "You'll have to take it up in court." Court takes months, years even. By then, they'd already be bulldozing my farm, tearing apart the memories and cashing in on what generations of my family built. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where my father once read the newspaper. My mother's Bible still sat on the shelf, worn and heavy with notes in the margins. I could almost hear her voice telling me to stand strong, to not let injustice break me. Tears slipped down my face, but behind them came something hotter, sharper rage. The HOA thought they could strip me bare, leave me powerless, and walk away richer. But they underestimated me. They didn't know that my family's strength wasn't in the land alone. It was in me. The first sign of how deep their betrayal ran came 2 days later. Bulldozers rolled in before dawn, engines growling like beasts, ready to devour. I ran outside, screaming at them to stop, but the workers ignored me. The HOA president herself, a woman named Karen Whitfield, sharp-tongued, perfectly dressed, with eyes colder than stone, stepped out of her car. She smirked at me as though I were nothing but dirt under her heels. "You should have taken better care of your paperwork," she said casually, her lipstick too red for the cruelty in her smile. My fists clenched, but I knew hitting her wouldn't bring my land back, would only give her more power over me. That night, after the machines had scarred the fields my grandfather once plowed by hand, I sat in the barn and thought about everything I'd lost. My children had grown up playing hide and seek between the haystacks. My wife had planted her first flowers by the front porch, and every Thanksgiving we'd gathered here as a family. Now, all of it was being erased. My wife Anna sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. "Don't let them win," she whispered. Her eyes were red from crying, but in her voice there was steel. She believed in me, even when I barely believed in myself. I started digging, not into the soil, but into their lies. I spent nights poring over records, deeds, and legal files. I discovered the HOA wasn't just stealing from me, they'd been doing it for years. Smaller plots, old families who couldn't fight back, widows too weak to stand against them. They gobbled up land and resold it for fortunes, building their empire of control brick by brick. And no one dared to stop them. That realization lit a fire in me. This wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about every family they'd crushed. Under their boots, weeks passed, and my anger transformed into something sharper, calmer. I didn't scream anymore. I didn't beg. I planned. Every lie they told, every corner they cut, every secret deal they signed, I documented it all. And slowly, a path began to reveal itself. They wanted my farmland to build their luxury resorts and golf courses. Fine, but I had something they didn't: connections, patience, and the willingness to strike where it hurt most. The turning point came when I found a loophole, buried deep in county records, overlooked by everyone except someone desperate enough to look harder. The HOA board members had financed their lavish homes by leveraging properties tied illegally to the land they stole. And if the land they stole was proven fraudulent, so were their homes. Every brick, every mortgage, every deed, it could all crumble with the right push. I sat back in my chair, the weight of that discovery pressing down on me. The farm might be gone, but I now held something even greater. I could take everything. From them, their houses, their comfort, their so-called American dream. They thought they'd buried me, but they'd only planted a seed. And when it grew, it would choke them. As the sun set over the half-destroyed fields, I stood on the porch one last time, breathing in the scent of soil and smoke. I whispered to my father's memory, to my mother's prayers, to every ancestor who had walked this land before me. They think they won, but this is just the beginning. I'll take it all back. I'll make them pay. The day after I uncovered the loophole, I woke up with a different kind of fire in my chest. For weeks, I had been broken, barely holding on while watching strangers tear apart my family's legacy. But now, for the first time, I had a weapon. And it wasn't rage or fist sit, was knowledge. The very system they had used to rob me was the same system I was going to use to destroy them. Still, the path ahead wasn't simple. The HOA wasn't just a few board members, it was a fortress. Karen Whitfield, their president, had power woven into every corner of the community. She had county clerks in her pocket, lawyers on speed dial, and neighbors too afraid to cross her. People whispered about her behind closed doors, but no one dared to confront her. That was the way she thrived, through fear. And if I wanted justice, I couldn't just fight her head-on. I had to dismantle everything she built, brick by brick, until she was left with nothing. The first step was gathering allies, but that was harder than I imagined. I went door to door, speaking to families whose land had been taken before mine. Most of them had already given up. Some had moved into small rentals after losing their farms. Others lived quietly in the same neighborhoods that the HOA now ruled, swallowing their resentment to avoid more trouble. When I told them what I'd found that Karen's board had illegally tied their own homes to stolen land, most of them just shook their heads. "You can't win against people like that," an older man named Thomas whispered, his eyes dull with defeat. "They'll crush you before you even get close." But not everyone was ready to bow down. One woman, Lydia, whose husband had died of a heart attack after years of fighting the HOA, looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you can really do this, I'll stand with you." Her voice trembled, but behind it was a strength born from loss. Another young couple, barely hanging on after their property was stolen, agreed to help too. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to build a small circle of people who were tired of being bullied. While they gave me courage, I still carried the weight of my own family's pain. Anna tried to stay strong for me, but I could see how it broke her to watch the kids cry, asking why the fields were being torn apart. My son, James, only 12 years old, asked me one night, "Dad, Are we going to lose everything? The words hit me harder than any punch ever could. I pulled him close, my voice cracking as I promised. No, son. We're going to get it all back. And they'll never hurt us again. But promises weren't enough. I needed action. I started digging deeper into county records, staying up long after the family went to bed. Coffee and rage fueled me as I traced property deeds, tax filings, and court documents. The deeper I went, the uglier the truth became. Karen and her board hadn't just stolen land, they had built their entire empire on fraud. Their million-dollar homes were financed through loans tied directly to properties they never rightfully owned. That loophole I'd found wasn't just a crack in their foundation, it was dynamite waiting to go off. The question was, how do I light the fuse? I couldn't just storm into court. The system had failed me once, and with the HOA's influence, it could fail me again. I needed leverage, something so undeniable that even their lawyers couldn't wiggle out of it. That's when I realized I had to turn their own arrogance against them. Karen and her board prided themselves on their community events, lavish galas, charity auctions, all designed to show off their power and generosity. Everyone in the county knew about them, and reporters loved covering their good deeds. It was the perfect stage. If I could expose their fraud in front of everyone, their empire would crumble, not just legally, but socially. Their neighbors, their friends, their allies, everyone would turn on them. But planning it wasn't easy. Every step carried risk. If Karen caught even a whiff of what I was doing, she'd bury me in lawsuits, maybe worse. I began to live a double life by day. I was the broken farmer everyone pitied. By night, I was a man with a mission, quietly building the case that would destroy the people who stole everything from me. The turning point came late one evening when Lydia handed me a worn folder her husband had kept before he died. Inside were letters, photos, even audio recordings of board members discussing their plans to take land from families. My hands shook as I listened to their voices, cold and casual, laughing about how nobody fights back. They bragged about how easy it was to manipulate the system, to use intimidation to silence people. With that folder, I didn't just have evidence, I had proof of their cruelty. But proof alone wasn't enough. To strike, I needed timing, patience, and the right stage. And fate, it seemed, handed it to me. A week later, I saw an announcement. In the county paper, the HOA was hosting their annual fundraising gala right in the ballroom of the fanciest hotel in town. Karen herself would be giving a speech. It was perfect. I spent the next days preparing like a soldier before a battle. Every document was copied and organized. Every recording was backed up. I met with a lawyer willing to take on the case once I made my move. And quietly, I told the small circle of families who had stood with me, be there that night. 'Cause when the truth comes out, I want them to see your faces. The night of the gala, I stood outside the glittering hotel in my old suit. The same one I wore to my father's funeral. My hands were steady, my jaw clenched. Inside those walls were the people who had mocked me, destroyed my family's legacy, and thought themselves untouchable. But tonight, that would change. Tonight. I wasn't just a broken farmer. I was just as waiting to be unleashed as the doors opened and I stepped into the golden light of their empire. I whispered to myself, this is where it ends for them. The hotel ballroom shimmered with gold chandeliers and polished marble. Floors, laughter filled the air, sharp and cruel, like the sound of wolves feasting. I stood in the doorway, adjusting my worn suit jacket, and for a moment I felt out of place among the glittering gowns and expensive tuxedos. But then I reminded myself I wasn't here to fit in. I was here to end them, at the center of the room. Karen Whitfield glided between guests, her red dress glowing under the lights, her smile wide and poisonous. She moved like a queen, surveying her kingdom, her voice carrying as she praised the community her HOA had built. When she spotted me, her smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before she replaced it with a mocking smirk. She leaned close to a man beside her and whispered something that made him laugh. I clenched my fists, but forced myself to breathe. I wasn't here for anger. I was here for justice. The speeches began, and Karen took the stage. Cameras flashed as she boasted about their growth and development projects, calling them a triumph for the county. My stomach turned as I thought about the bulldozers tearing through my farm, about the children who no longer had backyards, about Lydia's husband who had died fighting these same people. She ended with a flourish, saying, "This community thrives because we protect what matters most: our families, our future." That was my cue. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the applause. "What about the families you destroyed to build it?" The room went silent. Every head turned toward me. Karen froze, her smile cracking for the first time. I could feel the weight of her gaze, sharp as a knife, but I didn't back down. I walked to the front, pulling a folder from my jacket. "You talk about protecting families," I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded. "But you didn't protect mine. You stole 3,200 acres of my farmland, the land my father worked his whole life. And you called it community property. And you didn't stop with me. You stole from widows, from old men, from families who had no power to fight. You laughed while you did it." Karen tried to cut me off. "This is not the time or place." I raised my voice. "It's exactly the time and place." From my folder, I pulled out the copies of deeds, records, and letters. You built your million-dollar homes with money tied to stolen land. Every one of your board members financed their houses illegally, and I can prove it. I have recordings, documents, witness testimony, all of it. Gasps filled the room. Guests began whispering, some stepping back as though the truth might stain. Them too. I could see reporters scrambling, cameras snapping faster. Karen's face drained of color. "You're lying," she hissed, though her voice cracked. I laid the folder on the podium in front of her. "Then why don't you explain why I have recordings of your board bragging about stealing land? Why don't you explain why Lydia's husband had letters proving your fraud before he died?" At the back of the room, Lydia and the other families I'd gathered stood tall, their faces hard with determination. One by one, they nodded. Their presence alone made my words undeniable. Karen's composure shattered. She shouted for security, but by then the damage was done. Guests pulled out their phones, recording everything. Reporters were already pushing closer, shouting questions. Her carefully crafted empire of charm and intimidation was collapsing. Right there under the chandelier lights, but I wasn't done. I leaned into the microphone, my voice low but sharp. "You thought you could bury me? You thought you could bury all of us? But you didn't bury us. You planted us. And now we're here to take back everything you stole. Every acre, every house, every last brick of your empire." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Some board members stormed out. Others stood frozen as cameras caught their panic. Karen tried to maintain control, yelling about misinformation, but no one believed her anymore. The tide had turned. That night, I didn't go home broken. I went home knowing the war had just begun. I had just won the first battle. The next morning, the county paper's headline screamed, "HOA fraud exposed at gala." Reporters repeated my words on television, broadcasting the truth to every household in the county. Neighbors who once ignored me began to call, offering support, sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. The board tried to spin it, but every attempt only made them look guilt. IER. called me personally 3 days later. Her voice, once smooth and confident, now shook with barely contained fury. "You don't know who you're messing with," she hissed. "We'll bury you in court." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Go ahead, because every time you come at me, I'll be ready. And I promise, Karen, when this is over, you won't have a roof left over your head." I hung up before she could respond. For the first time in months, I felt peace. They had taken my land, but now I was taking their lives apart. One step at a time. As I tucked my kids into bed that night, James looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you win, Dad?" I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Not yet, son, but soon." And in my heart, I knew which was only the beginning of their downfall. The fallout from the gala spread like wildfire. By sunrise, every news outlet in the county was buzzing with the story. HOA fraud scandal, they called it, though those words barely scratched the surface of the pain they had caused. For years, people had whispered about Karen Whitfield and her board. But now the whispers were shouts, and the shouts were backed by proof. Karen tried to fight back, of course. She and her board called an emergency meeting the very next day, sending out letters claiming everything I presented was fabricated slander. They tried to paint me as a bitter farmer with a vendetta, a man too weak to accept change. But the problem for them was this: once people saw the cracks, they started looking closer. And when they looked closer, they found rot everywhere. Neighbors who once kept quiet now came forward with stories, threats, fines, underhanded deals. A widow named Mrs. Atkins told the local paper that Karen's board fined her $500 for hanging her late husband's flag outside her home. Another man revealed how the HOA forced him to sell his small property for pennies on the dollar, only to flip it weeks later for a massive profit. Each story built a wave of resentment that no amount of charm or denial could stop. For me, the weeks after the gala were a storm. Reporters hounded me for interviews. Strangers shook my hand at the grocery store, whispering, "We're rooting for you." But it wasn't all support. I began to notice unfamiliar cars parked on the road outside my temporary rental house. My mailbox filled with anonymous letters, some encouraging, others threatening. One note scrawled in red ink read, "Walk away, or you'll lose more than your land." Anna found it first and nearly crumpled it in her hands, fear flashing across her face. I held her close that night and promised her, "They can scare me all they want. I'm not walking away." Still, I knew I needed more than courage. I needed action. The gala had exposed them, but exposure wasn't the same as justice. For real justice, I had to take away the one thing they valued most: their homes. The loophole I'd uncovered became my lifeline. I worked with a lawyer who had agreed to take the case, a quiet but sharp man named Daniel Price. Together, we filed the paperwork, initiating a legal motion that tied their homes to fraudulent deeds. If the court recognized the fraud, and Daniel was confident it would, the homes would no longer belong to Karen and her board. They would belong to the county, open for liquidation. It was bold, risky, the kind of move that could change everything or destroy me. Karen must have sensed what was happening, because she escalated. She came to see me in person one afternoon, arriving at my rental house in her glossy black SUV. My kids were inside when I opened the door, so I stepped out quickly, not wanting them near her venom. She stood there in her heels, perfectly pressed suit, her smile like broken glass. "You've made your point," she said calmly, though her eyes were burning. "You embarrassed us. Congratulations, but you need to stop." "Now, stop," I asked, my jaw tight. "You stole my family's land, Karen. You destroyed lives. And you think I'm going to stop because you asked nicely?" Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game. You have a family, a wife, children. Accidents happen. Fires happen. Are you sure you want to? Keep pushing." For a moment, rage nearly blinded me. Every muscle in my body wanted to drag her off my porch and scream until she understood the pain she caused. But I forced myself to stay calm, That's what she wanted me to break, to lash out, to look unstable. Instead, I leaned closer and said, "The difference between us, Karen, is that I don't need to threaten anyone. The law will do my work for me, and when it does, you'll be the one with no roof over your head." Her face tightened, the mask slipping just a little. Without another word, she turned and left, her heels clicking sharp against the driveway. I watched her taillights disappear, my hands trembling not with fear, but with fury. She thought she could scare me into silence. She didn't realize she'd only given me more reason to fight harder. The court hearings began a month later. The board came armed with expensive lawyers, all in slick suits, all smirking like they'd already won. But Daniel was relentless. He laid out every piece of evidence, every fraudulent signature, every fraudulent deed, every recording of their arrogance. One by one, the lies unraveled. The judge listened, stone-faced, and for the first time, I saw Karen's mask begin to crack. In public, outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. Families who had lost their land, neighbors tired of the HOA's tyranny, even people from other counties came to show support. They held signs that read "Justice for Farmers" and "Stop HOA Fraud." I walked through the crowd with Anna and the kids by my side, and the cheers that rose up made my chest ache with something I hadn't felt in months' hope. The hearings dragged on, but every day the tide shifted further in my favor. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and declared, "Based on the evidence presented, this court recognizes that the properties in question were obtained through fraudulent means. Therefore, all tied assets, including the homes financed under these false deeds, are hereby subject to repossession." Karen gasped audibly. Her lawyers tried to argue, but the gavel hit the desk like thunder. It was done. I walked out of that courtroom lighter than I had in years. My farm was still gone, scarred by bulldozers. But now I had something else, the power to take back from them what they cherished most: their homes, their comfort, their pride. That night, as I sat with Anna on the porch of our rental, watching the stars, she whispered, "You really did it." I nodded slowly. Not yet, but soon. Because the next step wasn't just about legal repossession. The next step was selling off every single home they had ever lived in. And when I was finished, they would know exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The news hit the community like a bomb. Karen and her board had lost their homes. Their empire, the very symbol of their power, was slipping through their fingers. For years, they had walked around with their heads high, issuing fines for paint colors, lawns, mailboxes, acting like royalty over everyone else. But now, the very houses that gave them status were no longer theirs, and I was the man holding the pen that would decide their fate. But I didn't rush. Revenge tastes better when it's served slow, when every bite makes the guilty squirm. I could have immediately moved to sell their homes, but instead, I let them stew in the reality that the roofs over their heads no longer belonged to them. The legal notices were delivered, stamped with authority. Karen's house, her sprawling mansion with marble floors and a pool big enough to fit half the town, was officially property of the county, pending liquidation. The look on her face when the notice was taped to her front gate: priceless. She called me again, this time in a voice dripping with desperation. Gone was the queen of the gala, the sharp-tongued tyrant. Instead, she sounded like a cornered animal. "You can't do this," she hissed through the phone. "My children live here. My family." I cut her off, my voice steady, cold. "You should have thought about families before you destroyed mine." And then I hung up. The other board members weren't spared either. Their grand houses, their manicured lawns, their lives of luxury now all under my control. Some tried to negotiate, offering me money to back down. Others threatened, promising lawsuits that would never stick. But I stayed silent, unmoved. Letting the legal process tighten around their throats, the community began to shift. People who had once feared the HOA now openly celebrated their downfall. Neighbors held barbecues on lawns once patrolled by Karen's fines. Kids rode bikes, without worrying about rules. It was as though the chains had been broken, and for the first time, people breathed free. And everywhere I went, strangers thanked me, not just for myself, but for standing up when no one else dared. Yet, beneath the satisfaction, I felt the ache of what I had lost. My farm was still gone, flattened and scarred. No matter how many houses I took from them, I could never bring back my father's fields, my mother's prayers, or the childhood my kids had on that land. Some nights, I sat awake, staring at old photographs, the pain of it all settling heavy in my chest. Anna would sit beside me, her hand resting on mine, her eyes telling me what words couldn't. She knew that even in victory, grief still lingered. But grief doesn't erase determination. The time finally came. The county approved liquidation. Every home tied to fraud would be sold, legally and publicly. And I was given the first right to oversee it. I could choose the buyers, the terms, everything. It was poetic justice. The auction was held in the very same courthouse where I'd won. Rows of people filled the room, investors, families, locals who had once suffered under the HOA's thumb. At the front, each home was listed: Karen's mansion, the board treasurer's lakeside villa, the vice president's sprawling ranch-style home. All of them, one by one, put on the block. When Karen entered the room, she looked like a ghost of her former self. No red dress this time, no smug smile. Just a pale face, sleepless eyes, and a desperation she couldn't hide. She sat with her, arms crossed, jaw clenched, watching as her life's comfort was sold away, piece by piece. I sat quietly at the front, my presence enough to remind her who had brought her to this point. Every gavel strike was a drumbeat of justice. The treasurer's home sold first, then the villa, then the others. Each time the board members flinched, their shoulders sinking lower. Finally, it was Karen's mansion. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp and confident, calling for bids. Hands shot up from investors, but then something unexpected happened. Lydia, the widow who had once stood beside me, raised her hand. Gasps filled the room. Her husband had died fighting the HOA, and now here she was, bidding on the very house of the woman who had mocked their pain. Karen turned, her face twisting in horror. "You wouldn't dare," she spat across the room. But Lydia's voice rang clear, filled with strength. "This is for my husband. For every night you made us suffer." The auctioneer slammed the gavel. "Sold." The room erupted in applause. Karen buried her face in her hands, her world crumbling. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tight knot with regret, but with the bittersweet satisfaction of knowing justice wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone they had hurt. That night, I walked out of the courthouse into the cool evening air. My family was waiting for me, their smiles bright, their arms wrapping around me in relief and pride. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. But peace wasn't the end. Because as much as I had taken from them, as much as I had won, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to fade quietly into the night. She would claw, she would fight, she would try to rebuild. And I would be ready, because justice isn't a single strike hits a storm. And I was only halfway through letting it rage. The weeks after the auction should have been the sweetest of my life. Karen and her board were stripped bare, their homes gone, their reputations shattered. Families who had been bullied for years were finally free, and strangers treated me like a hero. Everywhere I went, people shook my hand, called me brave, thanked me for standing up. My children looked at me with pride again, and Anna's smile carried a light I hadn't seen in months. But underneath the victory, a shadow lingered. Because Karen wasn't finished, she refused to leave quietly. Word spread that she had moved into a small rental outside of town. A far cry from her marble mansion, but she wasn't living in silence. She was gathering her allies, whispering into ears, spinning lies about how I had stolen from her. She claimed I manipulated the system, that I was no better than she was. And, though most people didn't believe her, a few still did. Power doesn't die easily. It claws, it bites, it lingers. One evening, as I sat with Anna on the porch of our rental house, sipping coffee under the fading sun, a car slowed in front of the driveway. For a moment, I thought it was another neighbor coming to thank me, but the car didn't stop, lingered. Headlights glaring, my chest tightened. When it finally drove off, I recognized the shape of the SUV. Karen's Anna placed her hand over mine, her voice trembling. "She's watching us." "I know," I whispered back. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the deeds and court papers that had brought me this far. Justice was mine, yes, but I knew Karen was planning something. She had lost everything, and people like her don't forgive, they strike back. Sure enough, the next morning, I was served. Karen had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming emotional distress, defamation, and financial sabotage. It was laughable, a desperate attempt to claw back power. But lawsuits cost money, and I didn't have the endless resources she used to enjoy. Daniel, my lawyer, assured me we'd win, but his tone was cautious. "She's hoping to wear you down, to bleed you dry in court. This isn't about winning, it's about punishing you." And she nearly succeeded. The case dragged on for weeks. Every time I walked into that courthouse, Karen was there, sitting tall, her eyes locked on me like a predator, waiting for weakness. Reporters followed every step, documenting the war between us. I kept my head high, but inside, the exhaustion ate at me. My children saw less of me. Anna carried the weight of holding our family together. Some nights, I sat on the edge of the bed, wondering if I'd made a mistake by pushing this far. But then, I remembered my father. I remembered the calloused hands that tilled our soil, the pride in his voice when he told me, "This land is our blood, son. Never let anyone take it from you." And I knew I couldn't quit. Not when I was this close. The court finally ruled in my favor. Karen's case was thrown out as baseless. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clattering like gunshots, her face twisted in rage. For the first time, I saw her not as powerful, not as dangerous, but as pitiful. She was nothing more than a shell of the tyrant who once ruled the neighborhood. But fate wasn't done writing her downfall. A week later, the county announced further investigations into HOA dealings. What started with my case had opened a floodgate, and state authorities were now involved. Bank accounts were frozen, hidden deals uncovered. One by one, more board members were arrested for fraud, embezzlement, even tax evasion. And Karen, she was at the center of it all. I'll never forget the day I watched the news and saw her being led out of her rental house in handcuffs. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her face pale with fury as reporters swarmed her. She shouted, cursed, claimed innocence, but no one listened anymore. The queen of control had fallen, and the world finally saw her for what she was: a thief, a bully, a fraud. When I told Anna, she smiled through tears. "It's over," she whispered, wrapping her arms around me. "It's finally over." But in my heart, I knew it wasn't quite over, not yet. Because while Karen was being dragged through the courts and her empire lay in ruins, there was one final act left for me. Justice wasn't complete until I closed the circle, and that circle was my land. The 3,200 acres that had been stolen, scarred, bulldozed it, was still out there, waiting. The developers who had partnered with the HOA were now under investigation, their contracts collapsing. For the first time since this nightmare began, there was a real chance, that the land could return to me. I stood at the edge of the fields one evening, the sun setting in streaks of gold across the horizon. The soil was wounded, but it was still mine in spirit. I placed my hand on the earth and whispered, "I'm bringing you home." Because revenge wasn't just about destroying them. It was about rebuilding us. The auction hall was silent as the final gavel slammed against the block. Every home that had once belonged to the HOA board members was gone, sold to new buyers, investors, and even some of the very farmers they had mocked for years. The same farmers who had been cheated alongside me now stood tall, their heads high, their dignity restored. The irony was almost too poetic. The people who once strutted around as kings of the neighborhood had now been stripped of their castles, their foundations ripped away one brick at a time. They thought they had taken my land, my livelihood, my family's honor. But I took everything they ever cared about, and I did it without breaking a single law. But victory didn't taste sweet immediately. As I left the auction hall, I felt an odd emptiness. I remembered the nights my wife cried herself to sleep, wondering if we would lose everything. I remembered the day my son slammed his fist against the barn wall, saying he'd never forgive them for humiliating us in front of the entire town. I remembered the fear in my daughter's voice when she asked if we'd have to move away. Those scars were deep, and no amount of money or land could erase them. For a moment, I asked myself, was revenge truly enough? Or had I lost too much? In the process, that question lingered until I walked back onto my land, the very 3,200 acres they once tried to steal. The soil smelled rich. The fields stretched farther than the eye could see, golden with the promise of harvest. My father's memory whispered in the breeze, reminding me that this land wasn't just dirt. It was our history, our sacrifice, our identity. Standing there, I realized something. Revenge wasn't the end of my story. Healing was. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift off my chest. News of the HOA's downfall spread fast. Some of them tried to fight back, to sue me, to crawl out of the hole they had dug for themselves. But the contracts were airtight, the sales final. Their arrogance had blinded them to the laws they broke, and now justice had its hands firmly around their throats. One by one, I watched them move out of the homes they once bragged about, packing their lives into old trucks and trailers, faces pale with shame. Some cursed me, some wept, and some, like Karen the woman, who had always been the loudest voice against my family, stood frozen, too broken to speak. I won't lie, watching them fall apart gave me a sense of closure. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because I finally knew they could never again hurt another family the way they hurt mine. Their empire of control and greed was gone. And what was left? Just ordinary people, stripped of power, forced to face the consequences of their cruelty. But the most powerful moment came weeks later. My wife and I held a small gathering on the farmland. The community came, farmers, neighbors, friends who had watched our battle from the sidelines. They brought food, music, and laughter. My children ran through the fields, their laughter echoing across the open land, a sound I hadn't heard in too long. As the sun set, painting the sky in deep red and orange, my wife took my hand and whispered, "We're free now." And for the first time, I believed her. Freedom wasn't about destroying the HOA. It wasn't about the homes I sold or the fortunes I dismantled. Freedom was standing on my land with my family safe, my dignity restored, and my father's legacy alive, in every blade of grass beneath my feet. The HOA thought they had taken everything from me, but in the end, they only gave me the chance to rise stronger than ever. I looked out at the crowd, raised a glass, and said, "To justice. To family. To never letting greed win over what's right." The cheers that followed weren't just for me. They were for all of us who had been crushed under the weight of arrogance and corruption. That night, the stars seemed brighter, the air lighter. My children fell asleep in the grass. My wife leaned on my shoulder, and I knew with certainty that this chapter of our lives had closed. The HOA was gone. The pain they caused would always leave scars, but scars are proof of survival, not defeat. And as long as my family stood together, as long as this land remained under our feet, no one, not an HOA, not a greedy neighbor, not even fate could ever take it away again. So I did the only thing left to do. I knelt down, scooped up a handful of soil, and whispered into the earth, "We won, Dad, we finally won." And in the quiet of the night, I swore I could feel him smiling,